This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Ready to pop the question? The jewelers at BlueNile.com have got sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds, and they're ready to ship to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema.
I was one of those, it was my Phantom Menace moment where I sat in the cinema willing it to be better than it actually was and sort of liking some aspects of it. Now, I've rewatched it for this conversation, and it's both worse than I remember and better than I remember.
Isn't it? I think that's that's kind of my reaction to it as well when I watched it again recently.
One thing just from the very get-go is the title sequence being basically what the Marvel title sequence would become, which is a sort of leafing through old comic books and images of Judge Dredd, kind of to show its provenance, which was a bit kind of weird when it came to Judge Dredd, because he was someone who was huge in British comics, but not in a Sylvester Stallone American comic way. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was kind of I think it was a weird sort of, it's a weird thing, isn't it? Because when it comes out, it came out in the same summer. I remember I was 20 when this came out. Give away my age. And I was at UCAC, the UK United Kingdom Comic Art Convention in '95, and there was a panel. This was just as the balloon was starting to come off the rose of all the kind of big comics expansion, and comics have grown up and all the rest of it, stuff of the late 80s into the 90s. They said, has anyone here seen all the three comic book movies that had come out that summer, which were Judge Dredd, obviously, Tank Girl,
which I also saw.
Yeah, which I also saw, and Batman Forever. I went up on the stage and spoke to Alan Grant, who was who had been obviously throughout the 80s co-writer of Judge Dredd, then wrote Judge Anderson on his own. So it was John Wagner's writing partner. Passed away recently. Was arguably the main Batman writer for DC for the late 80s into the 90s, and I think the editor of 2008 at the time, which was Dave Bishop, or the magazine. I can't remember which one he was doing, but they were on stage talking about that. And they wanted to pull up someone from the crowd to get up and talk about the films that had come out, and I put my hand up. I remember sitting on stage at UCAC, not very busy, talking about the three films, and it was let's just say there was a certain amount of derision for all three offerings, shall we say. And right. I think actually, if you look at it, that where it came out, you're talking about the kind of use of comic book imagery. I mean, in a way, that's a kind of throwback to Superman the movie, isn't it? That's how it opens. Theatre curtains open, and then there's a comic book. Okay, it's not Superman comic as we know it, but it's Action Comics. There's the kind of... So maybe they were thinking about it in that way. But if you go back to sort of the Tim Burton Batmans, which had been that was the thing that set the whole kind of train in motion, wasn't it? That kind of reaches that point in 95. There isn't really a lot of kind of playing up of the source material. Do you know what I mean? It's, even though it's quite a loving sort of version of very early Batman comics, those 1939, 40 ones. It's got that film noir. It doesn't really have any kind of, it's its own thing based on that source material. The one that comes afterwards, I think, which really kind of sets the tone for all the goofiness, is Dick Tracy, with all the primary, remember BE used all the primary colors. He only used those colors to try and make it look like a comic, all that kind of stuff. It was a hit. I don't think it wasn't as big a hit as Batman or anything like that, but it was successful. It had the big kind of cross. It had the same kind of pop cultural sort of multi-platform thing with Madonna's album. There was a lot of merchandise that came out. I don't think that necessarily sold as well as all of that other stuff, but it was expensive. I think that was the thing, wasn't it? It was an expensive movie, and it did deliver maybe in the way that they had hoped, but it was by no means a flop. It was a success. It was a successful film. So you've had a couple of those things. Then there's the Flash TV show that comes along. Doesn't do very well, but that's in that kind of same milieu. And then obviously you have by 92 Batman Returns, which is, still massive. Was the biggest film of that year, wasn't it? I mean, I don't think it didn't do as well as the first Batman. That's why they booted Tim Burton off of it. But that film was a big hit. People forget that now. That's been kind of rewritten out of hit, away forgetting that, written out of history because of the kind of, it was too dark, it was too this, the kind of all the toyetic stuff. It was still massively successful, and it was a massive deal. So comic book movies were kind of there to stay. But then that summer of 95, I guess, is when you see, when did Mystery Men come out?
Mystery Men is like late 90s, isn't it?
So then, okay, so 95, you go to that. That's the next big one, the next Batman movie. It's a totally different kind of gig. It looks like they've watched Dick Tracy. Tank Girl's rather goofy. Judge Dredd is kind of somewhere between goofy and kind of an exploitation movie, which is kind of really weird. It's like, Dredd's kind of an interesting beast because it's not a kid's film, and yet it's got things in it that are completely kiddified, and yet at the same time it then goes off into kind of Texas Chainsaw Massacre territory and weird science fiction, and it's kind of a bizarre kind of misfire in so many different directions. So yeah, I mean, so I got up and said that, so it was on the stage sort of saying, I quite enjoyed Batman Forever. I would revise that opinion now, maybe, as it's not by no means I always kind of think that that's almost as bad as Batman and Robin. This is an kind of popular opinion, I think, but it's truly dreadful. I mean, Tank Girl was a disaster and didn't really work at all, and kind of killed the character as well, really, as a going concern. Dredd, as you said, is worse and better than you remember. And I think that was the thing about Dredd, is that there are elements of it that are very, very striking and very close to it's, in a way, it's more of a 2000 AD film than a Judge Dredd film.
Yeah, it has the ABC Warriors just pop.
Yeah. So we'll come on to that, I guess. But so it's kind of playing with this. They've got all of them, I think, have got a very kind of imbalanced and sort of slightly unhealthy relationship with the source material. And I would say, of the movies that had been made up to that point, the comic book movies, the most successful ones were obviously probably the first two Supermans and the first two Batmans. I think in a lot of ways, Tim Burton, by the time he made Batman Returns, didn't care about the source material. He took that as a jumping off point and took it in a totally different way. But then very few characters are Batman and Superman that have that kind of sort of, they've got kind of a pop cultural cachet. I mean, by the time those films are made, they're kind of 40, 50-year-old characters. 95, Harold's Dredd, 17, 18 years old. Tank Girl's probably 10 years old, if that. So you can be more kind of Catholic with your kind of influences on a kind of Batman and a Superman in a lot of ways, because you've got so much. Batman's been to space. He's been, he's carried a gun. He's been, realistic. He's been completely unrealistic. He's driven around with a dog that wears a Batman mask. There's all these things you can do. Whereas Dredd, I think by that point, was obviously the biggest problem is he's completely unknown, generally speaking, to the US audience. And I think the elephant in the room, which is worth saying up front, is the best Dredd film is RoboCop.
They've already, all the qualities of Dredd that they have already been anticipated by RoboCop. And
stolen. Have you ever seen the behind the scenes stuff from RoboCop, where the original sculpt of RoboCop with Dredd's helmet? If you watch that, I mean, I think that's on the DVD or the Blu-ray. And then there's that, what's that stuff on Netflix? Is it Films to See Before You Die or whatever it is?
Yeah, the Movies That Made Us, I think.
Movies That Made Us, that's it. I watched the RoboCop one, which was quite good fun, and there is the shot of that in there. And if you take some of the lines that RoboCop has in the script, they're lines taken from like the covers of the Eagle color reprint US comics of the 2000 AD strips that they resold in America. So Miner and Umo, You Have 30 Seconds to Comply, I think, and stuff like that. And Dead or Alive, You're Coming With Me. All those kinds of things are from, they're probably, I think they're the Brian Bolland covers, aren't they? From those reprint titles. And a lot of that's sort of been lifted.
So you're basically getting Judge Dredd and people saying, oh, this is a rip-off RoboCop, even though it's the other way around.
Kind of. Well, I think the thing then is they've got to try and differentiate it from RoboCop, haven't they? And I think the influence of 2000 AD at this point is really kind of strong in the kind of in movies in general. Because if you look at, I mean, and it's not just 2000 AD, you've also got the French and European sort of sci-fi comic influence coming in, the Mobius, etc. Because if you look at something like Blade Runner, isn't that Mega City 1 in some respects? If you look at, if you look at stuff like Alien and Aliens, the sort of the texture of the world there's a lot of that type of science fiction from, the grittier kind of road trooperish end of that side of it in Strontium, all that kind of filtered into that stuff. You take, I think, by the end of the 90s. I mean, if you watch Total Recall, for example, Total Recall is quite a 2000 AD.
Yeah, the taxi cab guy just is
totally
straight out. He even looks like he's drawn by.
Oh yeah, Ian Gibson's art.
Ian Gibson, yeah, it looks like an Ian Gibson's drawing. It's really to the point of rip off.
I think there's a lot of there's a lot of stuff. So what I'm saying is that you go from 87 through to 90, you then get to kind of like say Terminator 2, which is there. Where science fiction cinema has gone, it's drawing heavily on that kind of influence, whether that's directly or indirectly. I mean, if you look at stuff like, when's Empire Strikes Back? Is it 1980? Empire's 80, isn't it? 80, and then you go into 83, Boba Fett's in that. That's all very, and you look at The Mandalorian now, it's very much like Strontium Dog. I mean, it's almost like it kind of could be Strontium Dog. And interestingly, John Wagner wrote a load of Boba Fett comics for Dark Horse in the 90s, I think, because obviously that's all this stuff goes around. These people are not existing in a vacuum. So, I think the influence is, I think Dredd had a kind of underground influence that was then, when you then try to make something, I mean, and I think the thing this is interesting with Dredd in 95 is it's a big budget movie, relatively speaking, with a huge movie star at the centre of it. So in a way, that's kind of that's sort of like antithetical to what 2000 AD is and what Dredd is.
Because, I mean, I always felt that Dredd was coming out of Clint Eastwood. I always felt there was a Clint Eastwood sort of Dirty Harry, Man with No Name, sort of emotionless. I mean, he's supplanted the law for his personality, really. And there was a dark humor to it. But, I mean, that's what they end up, because they've got Sylvester Stallone and because he wants to be loved. You have him sort of growing and becoming more human. And it's just like, ugh.
Well, there's big changes. They make big changes to the kind of, Dredd is a clone, isn't he? And Dredd knows he's a clone, and Dredd is bred to deliver the law in this dystopian, authoritarian future. And in the film, they make it that he doesn't know that. I thought I was a real person, and I had a family, but it's all a lie. You lied, so you can have the bit moment where he screams, "You lied to me." Like those types of films. That was the thing I'd forgotten when I rewatched it, is that there was all that plot and how heavily woven into the kind of whole thing it was. And it's like, I mean, I think what they get right, I think it's interesting to talk about what they get right in the film. I think they get the texture of the opening sequence. I think when the first 15-20 minutes of the film are quite a good Dredd sort of intro. You go into Mega City 1, they've spent the money on building on the sets,
the different bullets, the armory, the motorcycle.
Yeah, you kind of introduce the kind of ephemera of Dredd very well, and it's beautifully designed, it's beautifully made. Funny, my DOP on my couple of my short films is Alfie Biddle, and his dad was the DOP on Dredd. It's Adrian Biddle, who shot Aliens and Thelma and Louise. And I asked him, he said, yeah, I shot that. So he was 10. And he said, yeah, I played golf with Sylvester Stallone. And my dad, he was a cheating bastard.
There you go. Sylvester
Stallone cheats at golf. But
I've got, can I just do my quick slice story? So I'm talking to a friend of mine, and I think he's sort of like had maybe a writing on one of Sylvester Stallone's films, one of the later ones. And he was telling me that they would, they'd be on the lot and they'd be walking to the canteen or wherever, the commissary. Stallone would be like talking, you see the thing with Modigliani and Picasso is they've got this weight of thing, and he'd pass some sort of crew member, and the crew member go, "Hey, Sly," and he'd go, "Oh, how you doing? Oh, and then go back. So anyway, what were we talking about? Modigliani. Yeah. Anyway, so the thing, and it's just like it wasn't like his public persona was a complete performance, but it pretty much was a complete performance.
Yeah. Of course it was. In preparation for this, I was watching Rambo 3 on the TV last night. I watched the end of it. It never fails to delight. But I think it's interesting as well watching that. That was just on. Didn't seek it out. It was on, and I watched it, and it was like, well, Sly's kind of right-wing politics sort of allied quite nicely with Dredd without really getting that it's a satire. So what you get with a Stallone playing Dredd is it's like this is a bit of fascism isn't a bad thing.
The lovable fascist.
The lovable fascist. Yeah. But anyway, I think the thing with Dredd with Stallone playing, if Stallone takes, the obvious thing is taking the helmet off. If Stallone's playing Dredd, you know what Stallone looks like. It's like, what's the point of like him wearing the helmet? it doesn't really make any difference. I think that's actually the least of the problems of the film. It's the helmet, no helmet, whatever. It's like people would forgive that if the film was kind of like true to Dredd's character, but it isn't, and it kind of really obsesses about, in that typical Hollywood kind of, action movie trope, post Star Wars, where there has to be kind of a familial connection, doesn't there, between the leads. Like Rico is the kind of, and he's not really the Rico of the comic. Rico really appears in like one story at the beginning of, very early on. It's not written by John Wagner, it's written by Pat Mills. In a way, this is much more like the Pat Mills. If you read like something like the Cursed Earth, original Cursed Earth story, I think the Dredd movie is much more like the Pat Mills sort of version of Dredd, and obviously you've got the ABC Warrior kind of thrown in there as well as another thing, little nod to his work as the developer of the first editor of 2000 AD, and a kind of the developer of the character with John Wagner at the start. I think there's more of that in it than Wagner's Dredd. Wagner's Dredd is not that kind of familial story. Obviously Rico's part of the thing, and it's been woven into the kind of tapestry of it, but done in a very different way over time. I just think it's a weird kind of mixture. They sort of do the wrong story and they do it in the wrong way, and then they want to kind of make it all about flying motorbikes and stuff like that towards the end, at a point when the technology is not there to be able to do that. Because frankly, even if you go back and watch the original Star Wars trilogy, the worst sequence in all those three films is that fucking speeder bike chase in Return of the Jedi. Right. Because the footage, and it just doesn't look realistic. And that whole thing of immaculate reality that Lucas talks about, which is perfect in kind of every other sequence of all three films, fucking hits the brick wall when you go into the forest and you can see that they're just basically in front of a back projection. It's like something from Torn Curtain. It's not that much better than that. It moves a bit faster, but it's, whereas I think, what they were doing at the end in Dredd is not good. And I think as well, the other thing is you've got a director that doesn't, I would say, if you watch Dredd, one of the big problems is it's shot so badly. Cannon, he's got he can't pull the camera back. You've got all these amazing sets. You've got all these amazing kind of like things that you could give the sense of scale. There's no sense of scale. There's a sense of it's a bunch of sound stages and cut together sequences. Now that's partly the way it's been edited as well and all the rest of it. But it's the fundamental thing is when we talk about vision, there is no vision. The frame is not wide. It reminded me a bit. It's what I don't like about J.J. Abrams is, particularly when he made The Force Awakens, that first Star Wars movie, is that you never believe, and I think this is true of him as a director full stop, you never believe that the world extends beyond the frame. When you watch the original Star Wars, you know that the world exists outside of where Lucas is pointing the camera. And even I don't like The Last Jedi as a movie, but Rian Johnson as a director creates a far more immersive world that you do kind of believe is going on outside of, whereas Canon, and it's not a surprise then that Canon ends up becoming, Mr. CSI, Mr. TV later on. That's what he is. I don't think there is a lot of, the thing with Dredd is it's not very cinematic. For all the sets and everything else, it's just not very cinematic.
And yet there's a weird thing in it that if the making of is to be believed, and certain, I think I watched a screenwriter, is it D'Souza, talking about Yeah, talking about what went wrong with the movie. And his argument was, okay, we were making this kids movie, kids action movie, and we had a toy deal and we had all this sort of stuff. And all the scenes of violence that were supposed to be implied, shadows on the wall and everything, he had filmed as, the guy getting his arms and his head pulled off and blood splattering on the floor. And they found themselves with this sort of heading towards an R rating.
Well, it was an R-rated film, wasn't it? Yeah, but that was no, that's right. But he's right though. That wasn't the plan. It was meant to be so there was a whole line of toys that were cancelled. So all the kind of cross-promotional stuff that was there in the kind of deal didn't happen.
Why have that violence and then have Rod Schneider as the sort of hand-holding comic relief? And he's got to go down as like one of the main reasons not to watch this movie.
Oh yeah, and I don't even mind Rob Schneider in like say 50 First Dates or stuff like that. I can quite happily watch him in an Adam Sandler film, but he belongs in an Adam Sandler film. He doesn't belong in Judge Dredd. And Fergie, the character that he's loosely based on, is not the same in. I think it's The Day the Law Died. I think that's it. It's just terrible, isn't it? I mean, it's just an horrific mismatch. You think they must have been thinking of Lethal Weapon 2. D'Souza would have worked on, I don't think he worked on that, but he was around the Joel Silver world, wasn't he? Well, it's a weird mix. Didn't Pressman produce the Turtles films, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films?
I think so, yeah.
If we talk about comic book movies, actually, that was the most successful independent film of all time when it came out in 1990. We talk about this kind of movement, we're forgetting that one. So Batman, Turtles, Dick Tracy.
Well, I mean, you could go back to Howard the Duck as well as another sort of...
It flopped, though, didn't it?
Its flop was significant in terms of how are we going to do this? How are we going to handle this?
And you kind of weirdly, that by the time you get to sort of Tank Girl, Dredd, and even Batman Forever, sort of the ghost of Howard the Duck is kind of almost sort of like is back. He's hatched again within these three films.
Is there maybe a problem with these properties where someone looks at something like Dredd and they get a universe and they get such a huge variety of things that they could possibly potentially make a film out of, that there isn't a compelling story as such to tell? Whereas I don't know with superheroes, because we're thinking specifically of non-superhero movies that are based on comic books, and Judge Dredd is a main character, but he's a character inside his universe rather than a superhero arriving from somewhere else or from having some special powers.
Well, there's two things, isn't there? I think there's the first is that they look at a property and they look at what they can kind of spin out of it. You're right, a universe, but they also look at what they can merchandise. And if you go back and listen to them talking about the making of Blade Runner, the producers of Blade Runner, and the split between Michael Dealey and Ridley Scott, and I guess Hampton Fancher, but particularly Scott and Dealey when they were making that film, is precisely around this. They want it to be a kind of Indiana Jones. They want to sell toys of the spinner. They want the gun. Does he have to squeeze his eyes out? Does it have to be dark? Does it have to be all of this? Because they want a Star Wars, they want a kind of, they've got Han Solo, they've got Indiana Jones as the lead. That's what they want, and that's not what they've got as a piece of material from either the screenplay or from the book, or also the filmmaker who made Alien as well. It's like that's what it is. So if you look at Blade Runner, I think there's a lot of parallels between that and the way Dredd is then done, because I think both of them are kind of weirdly financed, sort of independent things with studio. I can't remember who distributed Dredd. Was it Carolco or someone like that?
Yeah, Carolco. Yeah.
So they're not. It's not a studio picture. So that what you've got, Pressman as an independent producer, all these other kind of entities coming in, gluing together the finance on the basis that they're going to create this giant sort of like firestorm of merchandising potential. So we've got to have the robot in it, the ABC robot, who kind of is basically Hammerstein from ABC Warriors, but has nothing to do with Dredd. We've got to have the monster in, so we've got to have like the Angel Gang, the best part of the film, and we've got to have all this other kit. So we've got to have like bikes. He's got to have different, uniforms. He's got to have different outfits. They've got to be these zombie clone creatures at the end as well that we can kind of. So it's about that. It's about creating all these different things, but at the same time, and also we've got to have a movie star if we've got a budget of this size. But all of these things contort the thing because they've never looked at what they're buying in the first place. And if you look at RoboCop, which gets it kind of right, what it is, a satire on, ultra-violent policing in the late 20th century, and jumping forward into the 21st century, that film was made for what, $13 million? And RoboCop was a big success, but it wasn't a blockbuster. And they cut full foul with this when they made the second RoboCop of like the bigger budget. You know, that second film did not actually do particularly badly. Whereas, in fact, the film that this kind of looks like in a way is RoboCop 3.
Which I've never seen.
You've never seen it?
No,
Wow.
never seen RoboCop 3.
Oh, you've got to. Back to Frank Miller. Well, he co-wrote it, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
RoboCop 3 I don't think is as terrible a film as people say. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't call it a good film, but it's kind of like. But it's interesting. You've got this ultra-violent character who was in the first movie, who's now kind of fighting ninjas, and it's a live-action cartoon, and it's a shitty kind of cartoon. But there's a kind of. But it's an interesting way that they've kind of tried to aim lower to kind of widen the appeal, and in fact, what they've done is just cut the nuts off the thing. So, and they got, I think, Fred Decker, wasn't it, who did Monster Squad to do that? But I think that came out in '91. Eventually 92, something like that, so before Dredd. But there's a lot of parallels there where you're taking the intrinsic core of this thing and you're kind of completely, I wouldn't even say you're kind of watering it down, you just don't understand it.
Another film influence, that just reminded me of when we were talking about the Cursed Earth earlier, of course, is Mad Max. So you've got Mad Max in the background and the 3 George Miller films that have been released at this point.
Well, yeah, and there's also the court case over Hardware, isn't there? You know, the Richard Stanley film, which is ripped off of the Future Shock that Kevin O'Neill went and did, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He did with Steve McManus, which was a 7-page, I think, Future Shock. And then they were taken, and it's like, oh no, they've ripped off your film, and they ended up having to pay them, you know, for stealing their work. So the influence had gone really kind of deep by this point. But yeah, George Miller, I mean, you can't look at George Miller's work on Mad Max and not see it filter in through the whole of, you know, 80s science fiction. The Terminator is obviously hugely influenced by Mad Max, the first Terminator in particular. Even into Aliens, you can see like designs and style and look of that is kind of all the way through. And then also he does the other thing as well by cutting the balls off of Mad Max in Beyond Thunderdome and selling out. So it's all there. The whole range is there. No, it's unfairly maligned, but it's kind of the return of the Jedi of.
Let's move to Dredd then, as sort of we see how it's been done wrong, and I agree with you. The Angel Gang is by far the best part of the film, and sort of like it's just weird how quickly they wipe out their best characters, because they could have been the characters that were I don't know, following them back to Mega City 1 seeking revenge, and they're just like, no, we'll just episodically knock them out.
But they're good because they captured, I think they're the best element of the film, because they capture the kind of the sense of they're actually the only characters in the film that are quite funny, and they're kind of they are those characters kind of unfiltered. They're kind of like inbred kind of cannibal. They're the family from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, basically. And yeah. Mean Machine looks like Mean Machine and behaves like Mean Machine. He's kind of it's a perfect adaptation of Mean Machine Angel. It just, unfortunately, it's surrounded by the rest of this film, which is completely misconceived. They should have made the Mean Machine movie. That would have been much better. There is a strip, isn't there, called where he travels with his psychiatrist that they did in the 90s, which I always thought would have been a good. Travels with My Shrink, I think it's called, where he goes on an odyssey, and that would have been quite good. But yeah, no, so that's completely wrong. I think if I had a little email exchange with John Wagner,
yeah.
Whereas we come into the end of this, I asked him about what, not so much his views on the film in general, but his answer to this. I asked him about this. So when did it become clear?
Right, so the first one, when did it become clear that Judge Dredd was actually going to happen? Dunno. I suppose when I heard they were filming at Shepperton.
That might give you a feeling of his attachment to the project.
Exactly. Was there ever a version of the film that was more faithful to the script? Not that I know of. How involved were you? Totally detached. Was there anything that felt right on that first film? The recreation of the city was very good, as were Mean Machine and the ABC Warrior, though what it was doing in a Dredd film, I don't know. Some of the cast were good too. I wonder who. I mean, maybe Max von Sydow, and I quite like Armand Assant's performance.
Yeah, he's quite fun as Rico.
Yeah,
he's a good scene chewer, Armand Assant.
Yeah, exactly. You know, where I am the law. that line reading is particularly good. And do you think the underperformance of the film damaged the character? In terms of film, obviously, I suppose that means yes for the comic side too. And then moving on to the 2012 Alex Garland version of Dredd, Here his answers are different. I was soon informed and I was impressed.
by the people involved in making it. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. He met with Garland. This is John Wagner speaking. He seemed to have a good understanding of the character. I was prepared to wait and see what he turned out. Then you ask about Alex Garland candidly saying he fucked up the film, and Wagner replies he got a lot right. He kept dreading character that was the main thing. He was smart enough to know that with their budget, they couldn't afford the broad sweep of the first film. His original pitch, I think, had been to use the dark judges, and had he stayed with that, I think it would have made the film more standout and moved away from The Raid, which unfortunately came out shortly before Dread, which I remember being a sort of reference point for many. If you were writing a Dread screenplay, what would your film focus on? And he says, people have to pay to know that. So he's not giving...
That's the most John Wagner response ever.
So he's not giving anything away. So what was your reaction of the 2012
Dread? I'm probably less positive on it than most people. I kind of still think there hasn't been a great Dread film made. I wasn't working. I mean, I was at this point. I was working, so I wasn't working on 2000 AD at this point, and I've written a couple of Dread things. I've written Dread a couple of times in the prog, and I've done a couple of other series in the magazine since 2012. So when I saw the Dread film in 2012, I don't think I had a particularly close relationship to the character on the page as it had been. I mean, I kind of stopped reading 2000 in the magazine around about probably within a couple of years, maybe 98, something like that, 97, 98. So it probably wouldn't have been that long after the movie, the first Dread movie. So I hadn't really kind of dipped into Dread for years at all. As a comic book character. But when I saw so I went to see the film as a movie, it got very well reviewed. Yeah. And I was kind of disappointed. I sort of thought it was humorless. And I think he's right in that Alex Garland gets Dread right. He does get Dread right as a character. But the point of Dread is he's kind of like, he's not a hero, he's an anti-hero. He's kind of like, he's a fixed point in Mega City 1. And I think if you don't sell Mega City 1 as being this bizarre kind of parodic kind of mirror, version of our kind of society around him. If you don't get the strangeness of Mega City 1 in the way that if you don't get Gotham City right, you don't really get Batman right. If you don't do that, I don't really think Dread makes a lot of sense. Or that he just becomes a generic kind of tough guy. He's stoic in the face of madness. I think that's the kind of point. He is kind of that poise of Dread is he's kind of totally down the line and the world is absolutely insane. And in this, it just looks a bit like every other post-apocalyptic action movie. And it doesn't even, sometimes you say, is it even a post-apocalyptic action movie? They have a bit of a voiceover at the beginning about, nuclear wars and Mega City 1, but then they're kind of in a tower block. It's more like sort of, I think there's more of Dread in something like Ben Wheatley's High Rise, in the way that Mega City 1 is in the kind of the tower block, the insanity of that going on, than in anything. That's much more of a 2000 AD Mega City 1 kind of thing than the Dread film. I think they get Dread right. I think Anderson is pretty good in it as well. But everyone else is quite generic. I think it's I like Carl Urban in the part. I think he works very well. I think the way they kind of redesigned it in more kind of tactical cop gear, but in a way they kind of, it's like they're a bit embarrassed by Dread. Also, like they wanted. I guess the budgetary issue, which we'll come on to, is an issue. But it's also like it's a bit like when they made Man of Steel after Superman Returns, and it's like, okay, everyone complained he didn't punch anyone and he was too soft. So now he's going to kind of like rip people's heads. He's going to be breaking necks. Cities are going to be destroyed. It's kind of that sort of, it's a reaction in a way to the Stallone Dread. And I think what it doesn't do is look at what works with that. But I think John's right with the villain. I think that's where the film comes down, is that Lena Headey, who is a very fine actress, is completely, she's not memorable. And if your visual trick for the film is basically what's been used in every music video and video game adaptation for the last 10 years, that would indicate to me that's a cheap trick. And I mean financially cheap. Right. It's like we can slow it down and we can do it in 3D and we can make it this slow-mo drug. It's like, well, be anything. So I'm a bit ambivalent. And I think, The Raid is one thing where they did the sort of self-contained action in a tower much better because the action's phenomenal in that. But I also think something like District 9 came out not long before and did the kind of satirical sci-fi element of it so much better in a way that RoboCop did before. And it was like, I remember when District 9 came out, thinking, it's the first time someone's done something like this since RoboCop and done it successfully. And you looked at that and you just thought that's what it should be, and that's not what it is. That's not what it is. So I kind of look at it and think I watched it again not long ago, The Dread, and it's like, it's okay. I know there's a huge sort of glamour for it and a lot of people love it, but it didn't do very well either. You can look at I think he's right about Judge Death and things like that. I think the films are only as good as their villains as well. And if Dredd is kind of going to be put up against anyone, he has to be put up against someone who's actually a genuine threat. And Judge Death, you don't have to say it's going to be a big scale movie, but if you've got him, Dredd, who's this complete kind of ascetic, meat, flesh and bone kind of human character, and you put him up against a kind of supernatural force, then that's an interesting collision. And that could be an interesting collision kind of philosophically, character-wise, but also an interesting kind of thing visually as well. Not just kind of guys shooting each other across a kind of crowded hallway.
Which is what it ends up becoming, sort of stairways and corridors and apartments.
What do you feel? What's your feeling on it?
I think I liked it better than you in terms of just listening to your reaction there. But I do think that the clamoring for a sequel is kind of almost an admission that they need another crack at it, that it would be really good to see Karl Urban in a bigger budget version with more. But you know, you're not going to get that with a film that wasn't particularly successful unless it does a sort of Blade Runner 2049 sort of thing. But I don't think this Dredd is ever going to reach the cultural sort of impact that Blade Runner eventually did, you know. No. So I think that's fairly forlorn, unless, you know, the only way they're really going to make it is if they make a sort of a lower budget version, and that's
or the TV version that they've talked about for a long time. You know, it's like in a way, Dredd's probably better suited to that.
Yeah, but I mean, there were loads of sort of 2000 AD properties that have been talked about as possible films. I mean, Duncan Jones has been on about a Rogue Trooper for quite some time. That we've yet to see any evidence of. I mean, I'm not even sure if a script was ever finished for that or what.
I think there's stuff went on and there's going on, and Rebellion obviously have their own studio down in Oxford, this studio space, which is being rented out or being used. I don't know. I mean, there's the Rogue Trooper was one announcement, you know, then there was all the Dread Mega City 1 announcement a while back. But, you know, you've got to look at it realistically and say, the boom for kind of streaming content has gone. You know, Duncan Jones wouldn't be getting Mute made now. So it's like, I mean, it's all right you can announce that you're going to do these things, but who's financing it? It goes back to, I mean, if you look at both the Dredd movies, Dredd it's been funded by different, I think it was IM Global or whatever were involved in the second one. You know, it's an independent film. I remember they went out and they sold all the rights at the various different film festivals, pre-sold it, packaged it together in that way. That market doesn't exist anymore. And also the trouble with Dredd, and I think it probably spills over into other 2000 AD properties, is Dredd's failed twice. You know, if you compare the kind of grosses of the second Dredd movie to the first Dredd movie, it's nowhere near as much. I mean, the original Dredd did over $130 million worldwide or something like that, which in 95, if you kind of like extrapolated that forward with inflation and everything, I don't know what that would be, about 300, probably what Blade Runner 2049 did. But the Dredd movie from 2012 wouldn't get anywhere near that. It'll be probably do, I don't know, it's probably what you'd expect a kind of horror title to do, a middling horror title to do at the box office.
Or an Alex Garland film. I mean, you know, I mean, it's sort of he's got Men. That went straight to streaming, right?
No, I saw that in the cinema.
Ah, right, okay.
It didn't make money.
Yeah, exactly.
Annihilation went straight to streaming, didn't it? It didn't get released.
Yep. Ex Machina got a theatrical release, but again, it's that sort of middle.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
It's the sort of film that in the 80s you'd see on Channel 4 at 9 o'clock on a Thursday. It's sort of like really, I mean, in a good way, really good, really interesting, really all those things. But, it's not going to, it's going to have difficulty cracking through to a mass audience.
Yeah, well, it's not a mass audience movie, is it? I mean, I think if you want to look at Garland's most successful 2000 AD film, it was 28 Days Later. That's totally kind of imbued with the sense of 2000 AD. That's kind of like right back to the kind of raw, kind of late 70s, early 80s kind of edge of that. That if ever a film was written by a 2000 AD fan, it's that one. There's more of that in Dredd, and I just think Dredd's very generic in terms of the way it's directed and the way it's kind of, it's a troubled production. I think that's very much on record. Garland is more involved than maybe his producer and writer credit suggests. And the film, if you look at it, he probably should have directed it, but he probably wasn't. He probably wasn't going to be given the reins. But I think if you place it in a broader context as well, I think Garland's work on his own stuff is good. I enjoyed Devs. I thought that was very good. And I thought I like Ex Machina. I was not a fan of Men, I have to say. I thought that was not his finest work. But I wasn't a huge.
It kind of lost its way, didn't it, Man?
It was a conceit that didn't warrant a feature film, as far as I could tell. And you wonder how much COVID affected it, because would it have all been one man, or it was a film that was made within the restrictions of COVID? Then it was all kind of Rory Kinnear, and it was just it wasn't. It was a short film. It would have been an episode of Black Mirror or something like that, rather than a feature film. I never liked his version of his adaptation of Never Let Me Go, the Kazuo Ishiguro film. I didn't know.
I need to rewatch that. I remember enjoying it at the time and thinking it was a good Andy Garfield film.
Yeah, well, it's one of his first big roles, isn't it? I think.
Yeah. He's sort of one of the few good Andy Garfield films.
He doesn't choose very good ones, it has to be said. I just didn't think that film worked as on the basis of the world building. There's a lot of things that works on the page. I'm not sure it works on screen, and I don't think he cracked that. And that film died as well. And these films that die, they don't die because the audiences are stupid. I tend to feel. And that kind of didn't work. And I know, yeah. So I think Garland's the tone, and I think also his films are not very funny. And one of the things about Dredd is humor, whether it's Dredd's humor. Dredd in a way is a bit like Worf in Star Trek: Next Generation. It's kind of unintentional humor around him, and it's the kind of people's reactions, to what's going on. And they try and focus down on Dredd as an individual kind of hero as well seems mistaken. The idea of teaming him up with Anderson in the second one works well, but you'd want more of that. You want more judges. You want more of the Justice Department. You want more of Mega City One. That's it. It's just not enough of it. I think you don't. I wonder if you don't know anything about Dredd, whether there's enough of the world to grab onto for it to really make sense. And I think he makes more sense when you see all the rest of the stuff going on around him. So. But I thought Carl Urban was very good. I think he works very well in the role, and he did it. He gave it his all, and he got the character. And Garland was his fidelity to the character was strong, and is the film's best and strongest card. But I think it needed a bit of infidelity maybe to kind of make it a more successful movie. But also, you need to draw in more other stuff as well, and I just don't think it really did that.
I keep thinking, and I come back to this, which was my criticism, I think, of the first Dredd film, was I just think you seem to have a situation and a setting and a character, but not a story. And I think Garland tried to solve that by making the mission. It's just going to be a very straightforward procedural mission. You've got to get to this floor and take out this criminal. And the journey will be everything. And it's just, in the end, that could be, as you say, it's very TV episodic. It's it feels like a very small story for a big film, unless you're going to do something like The Raid, which is essentially the same story, but with much more bravura when it comes to filming the action.
Well, that's what I mean about the filmmaking, is then the bravura is the thing. It's what goes on in those. You can have a very simple conceit, but that's not how you execute it in those different kind of like stages. is the thing. The point of the raid is not that it's not, we don't remember the characters, we don't remember the story, we remember the kind of guy killing someone with a kind of light bulb or whatever, or jumping over a fridge that's fallen. It's the kind of, that is the point. That's the selling point. And the thing with Dredd is that if the visual trick is we can slow things down, and slow motion is really boring in an action movie as well. I don't understand why people always do this. It's like slow motion is the antithesis of action filmmaking.
It's like any James Bond movie where they fight underwater is a bad James Bond movie. It's for your eyes only, Thunderball. The minute they're underwater doing stuff, it's just like, boring, hurry up, Thunderball. They have a long underwater battle that just goes on forever.
I like a lot of Thunderball, but that just kills kills it. I mean, and it's true in the other ones as well. It's like, underwater fighting is...
I can't tell who anyone is. I don't know what's happening. Everybody's going slowly. So John Wagner then has... History of Violence, which you also questioned him on. Let me just bring that up again so I can. So he wasn't involved with this film at all, except to see the premiere.
He got driven in a limo, didn't he, and walked the red carpet.
This was a commercial success, to which he replies, "News to me that it was a commercial success. I certainly have never seen a penny of afters. I never felt that close to it, to be honest, always one step removed." The ending is different. I've not read the graphic novel. How different is the ending?
Completely different. What else does he say on there? Is that pretty much what he...
He says, "It's never been explained why they changed the ending. I have surmised that my ending, the better ending, was too violent for them."
Yeah. So do you remember the ending of the movie?
Yeah, it's just like a confrontation with William Hurt, if I remember rightly, in a living room.
In Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Does he go back to Philly?
That sounds right.
Yeah, because obviously, that's the deal. I mean, major difference is that there's the film compared to the book is pretty much a very faithful adaptation of the first chunk. So the graphic novel, The History of Violence, was published by Paradox. They called Paradox Press. Yes, they were called Paradox Press at that point, which was an imprint of DC. So he was kind of they did a bunch of, it was in the 90s, and DC had a lot of it, obviously after all the big success with like Dark Knight, Watchmen, all that. They initially tried to do loads of graphic novels and books for the adult market. They're not superheroes, nothing. This is pre-Vertigo, which was all the Karen Berger kind of fantasy-led, adulty kind of genre books that got Sandman, all those kind of Swamp Thing, that got kind of hived off into its own line. And I think when it was reprinted, History of Violence came out as with Vertigo on the cover, but that isn't what it was originally. So they had that, but they initially did this thing in about 89 called Piranha Press, and it was all kind of weird sort of outre cartoonists involved in the various books, and obviously, surprise, surprise, these things didn't sell. Then they kind of did a revamp of it, and they called it Paradox Press. And they went into these kind of small, I guess they were manga-size graphic novels, smaller books. And they were big books. And it's a very successful line, because the two films that were made out of the Paradox Press, essentially the crime line, but under the editor, Andy Helfer, who was the editor, was a very good editor at DC around that time, were History of Violence and Road to Perdition. So Max Allan Collins, Richard Reyes, that, and then John and Vince Locke's History of Violence. I think the deal was they didn't get as much on a page rate. They got a page rate for doing the book, but they got a much better deal at the back end. Right. As a creator owned, whether they owned all the rights or most of the rights, I'm not sure, but it was a much better deal. So they had that. So they were invited to do these books, and they're kind of, is it 390 pages? Originally they were selling them as chapters, but I think when History of Violence came out, it came out as a complete volume, and I think Perdition did as well. So they're like 250 pages. So it's kind of a graphic novel, but in three kind of chunks inside, so 390-page sections. And essentially, the movie is a very faithful adaptation of the first chapter, and then which is where, up to the famous point where Ed Harris is killed on the lawn. In the book then goes back into the past. So the second volume is like a flashback, and his backstory is very different. And then the final chapter is kind of back in the present. He goes, and it's New York, it's not Philadelphia. So obviously they've gone brotherly love, two brothers fighting at the end, isn't it? It's kind of like that they go for that kind of movie, simplifying. The end of the bit of the book, John's book, is basically someone has been hung up and tortured for 20 years, and he's essentially like a dangling torso.
Like something from Martyrs or something.
So so it's something like it's a bit like The ending is like a cross between the end of a Peckinpah film, Seven. I mean, it is unbelievably violent. I mean, the clues in the title,
Right.
and it's kind of like it's bananas. It's kind of more like in your sort of hostile end of the kind of scale
Neighborhood, yeah.
Whereas that isn't what the film is. Obviously the film is very different, and I think in a way it becomes about a character. I mean, John's is a genre writer. I mean, I think in that sense it's a genre story. It's a kind of full on kind of operatic thing. And in a way, it's very comic book. I mean, how you do that on the movie page, on the movie screen, I don't really know. The ending of the History of Violence is, it's all revealed. He goes back to Philadelphia and he has the confrontation with his mob boss brother, doesn't he? Who's William Hurt, and they have a fight, and it's all very close quarters violence, and it's kind of kills someone with a chair, doesn't he? I think, and then it ends. He comes home, and there's kind of like it's the kind of classic Cronenberg ending, isn't it? It's very much like Cronenberg usually does these kind of very kind of contained. He doesn't do set piece endings. Has he ever done that? Even The Fly is like 3 people in a room, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a chamber director. I think. I mean,
like
I love Cronenberg, but he's I don't think he's ever been as transgressive as everybody. Or he is transgressive, but in a very chamber setting,
Well, his films in many ways are very theatrical. He is transgressive, but he's quite narratively everything. There's the ending it ends in a kind of a scene, doesn't it? There's no, it doesn't. It's interesting with these films. These films don't end with imagery. These films are suffused with imagery. They very rarely end with that type of. I guess Good Hit All Hail the New Flesh is probably the closest to it. But it's like at the end of The Fly, he blows his head off and she's lying on the floor. The end of the Dead Zone, she's cradling him. That's the ending of a lot of his films. Is the cradling of a dead person. Dead Ringers is the two brothers like lying together, isn't it? Spider is kind of very sort of. So in a way, he's not the filmmaker you would get to make a comic book movie, and we don't think of the History of Violence as being a kind of comic book movie because a lot of people wouldn't know that it's actually based on a graphic novel. In fact, I do believe that Cronenberg didn't know. That's the story, isn't it?
Oh, right. That he just read the script and
story goes that Cronenberg basically Spider was made for literally no money for everybody as a labor of love for 2 or 3 years. And much like when he worked on Total Recall and it didn't happen, and he took The Fly because he desperately needed a job after 2 years of not getting a movie made. After Spider, he had to take a job. And this was a script that came along. Interestingly, they're his 2 biggest commercial successes, aren't they? The Fly and History of Violence. So he approaches it like a classic kind of film noir, I think. It's very like, it feels like a sort of 50s film noir, which is obviously there in the book.
It's like Burt Lancaster and the Killers and that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that is the Killers, isn't it? I mean, it's the opening of that, and it kind of springs from that. It's a classic noir kind of setting. And I think this is where it's kind of close to. I think Dread has got a lot of that in it as well. There's a lot of noir in the way that like Spirit has got it in it as a comic book, and the way Batman's got it in it as a comic book. There's a lot of that in it that's suffused with that character. But this is a kind of classic noir, the classic American diner. The interesting thing about John Wagner is he was born in America and he grew up in America. So
how long was he in America for?
Till he was about 11 or 12.
Wow. Okay.
So he was raised in America and then moved to Scotland when he was about 11 or 12. His parents divorced or whatever, and he's got a brother that still lives in Scotland. John's there's not a lot of what his background out there. Doesn't talk about that. But I think if you look at his characters, I think in many ways it's like this is kind of like History of Violence is someone who's run away from their past and kind of completely reinvented themselves. To most people, they think John Wagner's a Scotsman. I mean, he is, in so many ways, but he's not. There's something much more than that going on. And similarly in Dread is a kind of clone of the Chief Judge, and Dread is seen as this kind of robotic, kind of one-dimensional hard man. But there's much more going on in Dredd as a character. That's what I don't like about the Dredd movies is they don't get the kind of complexity of Dredd. Dredd is complicated. Dredd is kind of like he's a character born he's cloned. He's born outside of love. He's not born of sex. He's not born of any of those things. He's like he's in a way, Colossus Square always said he was like a kind of tax inspector. And yet there's an element of like the priest about him as well, aloof from everything. And yet he kind of is, in a way, Dredd's completely morally kind of clear. And if you then read, there's stories where you can play Dredd as the villain, like America. I don't know if you've ever read that in the magazine. It's one of the best. But then you can do a story like Necropolis, where Dredd is the hero. against that. And in both of that, and that character can contain both of those extremes. And if a character can contain both of those extremes, that's a great character. That character has never been put on screen. So I would take slight umbrage with what Wagner says about Alex Garland getting him right. I think he gets a very reductive version of Dredd, and I think Dredd's much more there's more to Dredd as a character than that. But then I'm saying as well, you talk about Johnny Alpha in Strontium Dog. Johnny Alpha takes on a new name. He's called John, for Christ's sake, and he basically you find out as that goes on that his father is the villain. And I had interview with John was talking about. He has talked about this in times. His father wasn't a particularly good guy, and that's why they came to Scotland or whatever else happened, and he was a bit of a tearaway as well as a kid. There's something there in Strontium Dog which I think is very personal as well, and I think there's something very personal in History of Violence as well, and I think probably in Button Man as well, the other series that he's kind of famous,
which he would like to see made into a film. It's
which has been kind of like optioned thousands of times by people like Nicholas Winding Refn. It's been optioned by J.J. Abrams. It's been optioned, and they've made quite a lot of money off the option, which has been 6 or 7 times. And I don't know if you've ever read Button Man, but the first book of that in particular, I think, is pretty much a masterpiece. It's one of the great British comics. Certainly the first one, and maybe the first 2 books. Certainly the ones drawn by Arthur Ranson, I think, are phenomenal. So yeah, that's the other one. So those are kind of the 4 towering works, I'd say, in his kind of canon. There's other stuff as well that people will kind of say is their favorite or whatever else, but for me, those are the ones that kind of stand out. Yeah, I mean, I think History of Violence is a interesting movie in lots of different ways because it's kind of a great picture for Viggo Mortensen. It's a great performance by Viggo Mortensen. It's Cronenberg's latter part of his career where there's a run of quite successful and bigger. He becomes respectable, doesn't he, really, after History of Violence, interestingly.
I mean, I think it's so interesting that you said, about History of Violence, The Fly being his two hits. I love The Fly. I think The Fly is really good. And I love early Cronenberg. I love I
love The Dead Zone as well. I think The Dead Zone is great as well.
Yeah, I think he kind of works really well. He has these great original films like Scanners and The Brood and those movies. But there's also, I think he also does work as a great director of other people's material. He is able to come in. Unfortunately, I think you're right. He does, in that latter part of his career, sort of start picking top projects. Like, I don't know, I'd like to see it again, but I found Cosmopolis, for instance, just a fairly dull picture.
I quite like Cosmopolis. I read DeLillo's book before I saw it as well, so maybe that was. I thought so. It was interesting from the point of view of the adaptation. I think Pattinson's very good in it. I mean, it's kind of like, again, if you go back to the thing about theatricality, it's very theatrical. It's very, very theatrical.
It's another chamber piece.
It is very chamber piece. But that final scene with him and Giamatti is almost like theory of the absurd, isn't it, all the way through it? I quite like A Dangerous Method. I think that they feel about another person's script. That's a very well done movie. I think that was very kind of coolly received when it came out. But it's very well done. It's much more in keeping with Cronenberg than people would normally say as well. It's kind of and Fassbender's very good in that. I think it's one of his better performances actually since he became very famous.
What did you think of Naked Lunch? Because Naked Lunch is one I find really disappointing. I think that's a real example for me of Cronenberg doing a sort of radio play adaptation, to sort of like it goes to that chamber element of his work where it's just a series of rooms. I don't feel there's anything outside of the walls of those rooms I don't think you can look out the windows and see anything. It's just very constrained by its budget.
I don't have a problem with I think that's one of the virtues of Naked Lunch.
Right.
Because it's about the writer, isn't it?
Yeah.
The writer's in the room. The writer's locked in wherever he goes, whether it's Tangiers or any of these places, Interzone, it's all kind of inside his mind. I think what you've got a problem with Naked Lunch is you're adapting something where essentially the imagery is reduced to a bunch of rubber monsters. No, you're not dealing with the video. The imagery in Videodrome is far more potent. Whereas and also the imagery in have you ever read the book of Naked Lunch?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So if the imagery in the book of Naked Lunch, I mean, obviously the film is not the adaptation of the book because it's impossible to do that. It's kind of like almost like Cronenberg's impressions of Naked Lunch, isn't it? Or some of the other material, Exterminator and other
Junkie
work. Yeah, the imagery in Naked Lunch is powerful and visceral and sexual and gay, and that's not Cronenberg.
Yeah.
Cronenberg's not really into that's not his thing, you know. It's so the imagery in Julian Sands as a cockroach buggering and eating a young boy just looks like a couple of bits of rubber gyrating against each other with a bit of Howard Shore music over the top. It's not kind of shocking. It's a bit risible. I quite like the Mugwumps. I think they're pretty good in it. And I like his talking typewriter and the sort of the track, all that stuff. There's a lot of things in it that I think are really good, but it's kind of one of those films where you cannot translate the imagery onto screen. And I think it's also one of those films. It's a bit like, actually, it's not like it, but in the same as Dredd, the 95 Dredd, is that what they're trying to do technologically is not possible at that point. Right. You know, I think Dredd, if the vistas of the city and the scale and everything, it's pre-CG, isn't it? So if you'd have gone, say, we talk about Phantom Menace, the Phantom Menace is where everything is like, okay, we can do a CG environment that is actually believable and immersive. And if we watch it now, 25 years later, you look at those shots of like essentially the digital matte paintings and Coruscant and all that, and you say that's really good. It stands up 25 years later. It still looks decent. The effects aren't there for that.
Yeah.
And when you take something like, we talk about Men before, we talked about Garland, there's a kind of similarity, I think, in filmmaking to some degree between Cronenberg and him. Men, while not being a particularly successful film, in my opinion, visually and with the effects and the way it plays with all that kind of body horror and everything, is able to do something that's kind of interesting visually with that in a way that Cronenberg's not able to do in Naked Lunch. And you're trying to ask for, I think the problem is too many leaps of the imagination. I can buy that his wife's alive and she's there. I can see, Ian Holm talking he's talking out of sync. I can buy that the world is not really the world. There's Bulkhead. I can buy his typewriter talking. The other stuff becomes too much. But I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's a very kind of, but for me, obviously, if you're going to talk about the adaptations, then by far the best one of those later ones is Crash.
Right.
Crash is a far, far, far better and more transgressive film than Naked Lunch. Because I think as well, Naked Lunch's transgressions are a transgression of the 1950s, aren't they? I am a homosexual and I am a drug addict. By the 1990s, we've seen quite a lot of that. That's not really sort of, also homosexuality is not illegal by the time that comes out. Whereas Crash, and fucking hell, you're talking about, it's still banned from being shown in Westminster, isn't it? I mean, it's, imagine you must have been in Britain at the time. Do you remember the furore over it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was like crazy. It was
no one mentioned Naked Lunch when it came out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. James Spader and Holly Hunter, and there were real, it was a real cause celeb, and you had J.G. Ballard coming out and delighted at how how horrified everyone was by his film.
Absolutely.
Which, by the way, Super Can is Brandon Cronenberg's next film. So the J.G. Ballard.
Oh, has that just been announced?
Cronenberg. No, I think that's been in the works for a little while. So I mean, we can believe it when we see it, but Cronenberg Phil is on a bit of a roll at the moment, and
he's got another film out himself next year, isn't he?
David Cronenberg has. Yeah, what's his film?
Called The Ruins, isn't it? I think it's the one. Is it called The Ruins? It's the one with Vincent Cassel.
Ah, okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. By the way, did you see, not Possessor? What was the name of the latest one? Infinity Pool.
I haven't seen it. No.
I really up there. I mean, my problem a little bit with the Cronenbergs, and as my problem a little bit with Naked Lunch is it's that thing of, it's a little bit like going back to Dredd and RoboCop. Once you have RoboCop, do you really need Dredd? And once you have, when you have Cronenberg doing so many interesting things from, The Fly and before, when he comes to do the Naked Lunch, which is the source of his his imagination, yeah, exactly. Then it feels like he's just treading his own work.
It's kind of oddly reverent in a way. Yes. No,
It's like
I think
John Carter, following all the things that John Carter inspired.
Oh, well, Avatar, yeah. So it's nothing differentiates itself, isn't it? No, well, I think it's true with Dredd. It's very much, it's been done by other people and it's been done in cinema better, arguably. I mean, it has been done better before that even came out. So that already puts you at a disadvantage. In a way, it's kind of the problem that people have when they're trying to redo Superman, that you cannot improve on what was done in 1978, because Christopher Reeve was perfect and that was perfect, and you can do stuff that might be, but you can't really kind of ever capture that moment again. They've had more joy with Batman because Batman in a way is a more malleable character, and also it helps that he wears a mask.
He's more of a blank space.
He is more of a blank space that can be embodied by Michael Keaton, or it can be embodied by, Christian Bale, it can be embodied by whoever. It's like there's multiple versions. Superman's a much more fixed sort of thing, and Dredd is kind of like, that's what I'm saying. I think that the simplicity of the way they've tried to kind of present it so far reduces it reduces the depth and the kind of unique things. And the unique things for Dredd is like the city. But yeah, you're right about Cronenberg. I think it's interesting. Then you go back to Ballard, which isn't the source of him, but I think the kind of what he gets with Ballard is an infusion of new stuff, which is kind of really interesting. And he pushes it, in a way that's not supernatural. There's none of the kind of props in Crash of science fiction, which is why when he goes back to that in kind of something like
Existence,
that kind of feels like his greatest hits.
Totally agree.
It's okay. It's like, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Spider is a great film. It's a great film. Going into the kind of, I think he's much more interested in that than going into the kind of the reality of this kind of transgressive idea, which is Crash to some degree, which is Spider, which is Eastern Promises in some respects, and even History of Violence as well. Dangerous Method. These are the films where really you're seeing kind of that played out in a more kind of adult, sort of fully formed setting. And I think the thing now, I mean, I didn't like Map to the Stars. I found that, I don't think he's a Hollywood satirist. That is not his métier. It would be fair to say.
Absolutely.
I didn't mind Crimes of the Future. I thought that was pretty good, but obviously clearly low budget and clearly made very completely kind of chamber piece there, because there's very little stuff going on. And it's interesting that now he's getting stuff made that is basically playing to that. Cronenberg does the weird stuff, and he can raise money for that, and he wants to keep working, and that's absolutely fine. But I think the kind of body of the really interesting work is that early stuff, and then that later stuff, actually, of which I would say History of Violence is obviously the commercial sort of like height of that. I'm not sure whether that's my favorite of them. I think I prefer Eastern Promises.
Eastern Promises I have to rewatch. I watched it once, and that's, Cronenberg is due a proper rewatch, I think.
It's interesting, I think, the way that they adapt different things. I think it's interesting that there's this kind of Venn diagram of Garland and Cronenberg on Wagner's work, because I think there is something about John's not a writer of the mystical and the supernatural. He's a writer of the real. Dredd is even though the world is insane, it's very real. If you read like Strontium Dog, Johnny Alpha deals, even though it's surrounded by all these funny mutants and all the rest of it, at the heart of it, there's something about Johnny Alpha that's very real. If you read Button Man, Harry Exley, it's very real. The kind of world, it's a world of chopped off fingers. And
what would be the one you want to see then next?
Button Man would be the obvious one to be adapted. I mean, I don't want to see any on it. So want to see anything really, but it's like that would be the one I think would translate the best, whether that's as a movie or a series. Probably as a movie. It's a bleak noirish. It's a 70s noir. It's suffused with a bit of that kind of paranoia of the 70s. Is a bit of that kind of Edge of Darkness element to it. That would be kind of the way you'd want it to feel, like Edge of Darkness. The series, the mid-80s series. Yeah, it's got something of of Troy Kennedy Martin in it. It feels like that. I mean, and you can see there's a lot of that element in him. I think he really is. He is a crime. I mean, I think his war stories. You talk about his great stories, stuff like the stuff he did for Battle in a lot of ways is as good as anything he did for 2000 AD. I mean, it's obviously restricted because of the page lengths and the censorship was kind of You're trying to neuter it a bit more for younger audience. But if you read something like HMS Nightshade, which I did a podcast on like last year, that is a masterpiece. It's on the ship in the Navy during World War II. That is absolute. That would make a magnificent kind of TV series or a film. I'd love to see that, actually, of all of the stuff. I think Darky's Mob is difficult to see that getting made. So, it's a great strip. I think at heart, war and crime are his things. There's something, while he's in the world of science fiction through Dredd, and they're not really science fiction in the way that you'd.
Yeah, I mean, they're still sort of crime procedurals, and I mean, Dredd is sort of often. I mean, that's what I think is fascinating about what you're talking about, the madness of the world. And Dredd is the guy who comes along and goes 3 years, so he just sentences people, and he just literally puts people in boxes. And
it's literally, he does do that. That's why Carlos is right when he says he's a tax collector. Kind of like he's a kind of he's got a bureaucratic mindset. He's good at paperwork, Dredd. You can imagine. He's very.
I do love the Apocalypse War. I wish that's probably my.
Oh yeah, I think that really is where Dredd becomes Dredd. I don't think Dredd is really. I think Dredd's quite inchoate before then. It's sort of forming in those early years in the way that Batman formed slowly over a few years.
I think watching, I don't think it's even overstating it to say that reading that series of strips gave me a real jump as to what stories can do in terms of tearing up their own worlds and saying, you think this is where normally the hero would save the day. No, they launch the nuclear weapons. They're
also, and he executes loads of his own people because they're dying of radiation sickness as well.
Yeah.
That's what the mercy killing. There's a very pragmatic kind of element to it.
I'd love to see that in a film. I'd love to see that Dredd.
Oh yeah. No, brilliant. I mean, he's like, this is what we've got to do. It's interesting though, if you read the recent stuff that he does still write Dredd, not as much now as he did before. But he wrote some amazing stuff in Dredd a few years back. He did a series called Guatemala. They go to Guatemala, funny enough, which is run by robots. Colin McNeil did what's it called? America. Carlos is no longer with us. It's kind of I guess he's the main Dredd artist. If he does Dredd, I mean maybe Dan McCormick as well, but particularly Colin. But that's as good as anything he's ever written for Dredd, I think. They did another one before in Machine Law. He's still pushing Dredd. When he does write Dredd into kind of interesting fashion, into interesting territory, and doing kind of unusual sort of things with him, and he writes, I think his understated style is very often seen as being unemotional, whereas in fact there's a lot of emotion in it. What he isn't is romantic. He's not a romantic writer. He doesn't write, the romance of heroes and stuff. There's a great Johnny Alpha story that he wrote towards the after they brought him back in the latter part. And if you read those early Strongman books, there's loads of them are so great. But there's this one called a Traitor to His Kind, where he ends up being kind of hated by the mutants who are on Earth and everything. And it's just fantastic, that story. And it's got the final page and the kind of the writing on it. It's about, I think does he bury his mother or something in it? I can't remember. I'll have to go back and have a look at the book. But it's kind of like phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And America, it's all about transgressive. You've got a kind of transgender lead character in this, narrating a story about oppression where he's the character that he's made kind of his career out of is shown in the worst possible light. And it's and that was done in 1990, 91. It's like, I think that, I just think he's hugely underappreciated. I've said this on other things before. I mean, if you talk about Alan Moore, there's a huge amount of influence of Alan Moore in popular culture, but there is a huge amount of John Wagner in the way that British writers or European writers or American writers have kind of have gone on. I think a lot of his influence is maybe less acknowledged. Maybe he certainly is not as interested in promoting Brand Wagner in the way that Brand Moore has been kind of promoted. And I think interestingly as well that despite all of Alan Moore's kind of like protesting, he's never really played. John's never played in the superhero pool, and Alan Moore has. That's why. That's why it's because of Swamp Thing. It's because you worked on Batman. It's because you did The Killing Joke. It's because you did Watchmen. His work has been done in much more slightly more peripheral kind of genres. You can see his influence in people like Garth Ennis, and I think you can see a huge amount of Wagner in The Boys. Huge amount of that in The Boys. A lot of Pat Mills as well, but a lot of Wagner in The Boys. And Garth Ennis is really the kind of person who's really taken on what Wagner did and acknowledges that quite openly. So for me, he stands alongside Alan Moore as the most significant writer that British comics has ever produced. And I think without a shadow of a doubt.
Well, in that case, I want to propose we do this. Let's table Alan Moore for part 3 of our new podcast series. John and James talk comic books and movies.
What are the Alan Moore movies?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, wow. Why not? Because I mean,
that'd be quite fun. Yeah, let's do Alan Moore. That'd be quite good because I haven't seen those films. God. From Hell, was there? So that would be From Hell, V for Vendetta, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen,
Watchmen.
Yeah, I've seen Watchmen quite a few times. Sort of, but yeah, no, that's good. We do that. But you want to talk about Frank Miller?
Well, that might even be the.
Part 4.
Yeah, exactly.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.